His body is covered in scars. Every handspan of skin bears a mark. Sword strikes across his shoulders, arrow wounds through his ribs. Spear thrusts that carved channels in his flesh and somehow miss the organs beneath. Decades of unbroken combat across 3 continents, written in scar tissue. He is dying in a bed. He has not held field command in 4 years. The weapons hang on the wall across from him. Sword, shield, lance. The tools that made him the most decorated, undefeated general in the ancient world. He looks at them the way a man looks at limbs that have been amputated. His breathing is shallow, not a battlefield injury, not an honorable wound reopened, sickness, disease, the body giving out from the inside, in a room, at peace. No army had ever done this to him, no empire, no battlefield. The Caliph of Islam dismissed him at the peak of his power and he accepted the order without protest. That is the part that makes no sense. A man who could have taken the caliphate by force, who commanded the loyalty of every soldier who had ever served under him, who had proven against every army that ever faced him that no force on earth could stop him, was told to step down, and he obeyed. Served for 4 more years as a subordinate, bequeathed his entire estate to the man who fired him, and made him executor of his will. The Prophet Muhammad had given him a title, Saif Allah, the Sword of God. The title was not metaphorical, it was an assignment. A sword does not choose when it is drawn. It does not choose when it is sheathed. It does not question the hand that wields it. Khalid ibn al-Walid defeated Persia and Rome and still lost. He lost to the one enemy no battlefield could produce, the judgment of the man who trusted him most. And he spent the last 4 years of his life trying to understand whether that made him a failure, or whether he had succeeded so completely at being what God made him that the institution could no longer afford to keep him. His last recorded words, "May the eyes of cowards never sleep." The world that made him that way was not a nation. It was a peninsula of tribes held together by temporary alliances, blood feuds that spanned generations, and a shared language that could not produce political unity. The empires on its borders, Byzantium to the north, Persia to the east, viewed the Arab tribes the way Rome had once viewed the Germanic peoples beyond the Rhine, useful as mercenaries, dangerous in numbers, fundamentally incapable of organizing into anything resembling a state. Mecca was the wealthiest city in the Hijaz, and its wealth came from pilgrimage. The Kaaba housed hundreds of tribal idols. Every tribe in Arabia sent representatives once a year to honor their gods in a neutral sacred space where blood feuds were temporarily suspended. The Quraysh, the tribe that controlled Mecca, profited immensely from this arrangement. They were merchants and managers of the sacred. They had no interest in theological revolution. Khalid ibn al-Walid was born into the Quraysh aristocracy sometime around 592. His father was a minor clan leader. His family was wealthy enough to afford horses and weapons training. He grew up learning cavalry tactics in a society that did not yet have armies, only raiding parties, tribal militias, and mercenary bands. He was a professional soldier before there was anything professional to serve. When Muhammad began preaching monotheism in Mecca around 610, the Quraysh aristocracy understood immediately that this was an existential threat. If there was only one God, the Kaaba's business model collapsed. If all tribes were equal before that God, the Quraysh's monopoly on the sacred ended. The early Muslims were persecuted, starved, tortured. In 622, they fled to Medina. Khalid was on the other side. In 625, the Quraysh sent an army to destroy the Muslim community in Medina before it could grow large enough to threaten Mecca's control of the pilgrimage trade. The battle took place at the base of Mount Uhud, just outside Medina's northern boundary. Muhammad commanded roughly 700 men. The Quraysh brought 3,000. Khalid commanded the cavalry. The Muslims held the high ground initially. Muhammad posted 50 archers on a hill to protect the left flank and gave them explicit orders not to leave their position under any circumstances. The battle began badly for the Quraysh. Their infantry was pushed back. The archers on the hill began firing into the Quraysh rear. It looked like a rout. The archers abandoned their position to collect spoils from the fleeing Quraysh. From horseback on the far right of the Quraysh line, he saw what they had done before the dust settled. The hill was empty. The Muslim left flank was open. The distance between where his cavalry stood and where it needed to be was 200 yards of open ground, 30 seconds at full gallop. The decision took less time than that. He saw the gap. He took his cavalry around the hill, hit the Muslim rear, scattered the archers, and turned the entire battle. Muhammad was wounded, his helmet shattered, his face bleeding, a tooth knocked out. The Muslims retreated in chaos. That flanking maneuver had nearly destroyed the early Islamic community in a single afternoon. He did not know it yet. Neither did Muhammad. 4 years later, in 629, he converted to Islam. The sources do not record a dramatic theological epiphany. He understood when a cause was lost. Muhammad accepted him without hesitation. There is a recorded meeting, brief, direct. Muhammad asked why he had waited so long. He said he had been blind. Muhammad said God guides whom he wills. Then Muhammad gave him the title, Sayf Allah al-Maslul, the drawn sword of God. The title was not ceremonial. In a theocratic state where every victory was attributed to divine intervention, being named the instrument of that intervention was a job description. He was no longer a man who fought for Islam. He was the weapon God used to fight. The distinction mattered. It meant that when he won, the credit belonged to God. It also meant that if he ever lost, the doctrinal implications would be catastrophic. He never lost. Muhammad died in 632. The entire political structure of the new Islamic State immediately collapsed. Tribes across Arabia that had pledged allegiance to Muhammad personally decided that the pledge had died with him. They stopped paying the zakat, the obligatory alms that funded the state. Some declared independence. Others followed new prophets who claimed the same divine mandate Muhammad had claimed. Abu Bakr, the first caliph, faced a choice: accept that Arabia would fragment back into tribalism, or use force to preserve the unity Muhammad had created. He chose force. The Ridda Wars, the wars of apostasy, began within months of Muhammad's death. Abu Bakr gave him overall command. The historian al-Waqidi, Muhammad ibn Umar al-Waqidi, who died in 823, documented these campaigns in his Kitab al-Maghazi with the kind of tactical detail that suggests he had access to participants or their immediate descendants. What al-Waqidi describes is not a series of battles. It is systematic annihilation. He moved faster than his enemies could coordinate. He would force march his cavalry across distances that should have exhausted his men and horses, arrive at full combat readiness, destroy a rebel force before it could call for reinforcements, and move on to the next target before the survivors could regroup. He fought 12 major engagements in less than a year. He won all of them. The most important was the Battle of Yamama, against a rival prophet named Musaylima, who commanded the Banu Hanifa tribe. Musaylima had roughly 40,000 warriors. His own force numbered 13,000. The battle lasted an entire day. The Muslims were pushed back initially. Musaylima's forces fought with the desperation of men, defending their homes and their prophet. He regrouped, reinforced his center, and pushed into the Banu Hanifa fortified garden where Musaylima had retreated. The fighting was close and brutal. Musaylima was killed. The Banu Hanifa were destroyed as a fighting force. Arabia was unified for the first time in its history. He had accomplished in 1 year what no tribal confederation had ever managed. He had turned a peninsula of independent clans into a single political entity held together by force and the credible threat of overwhelming violence. The Ridda Wars were not just military campaigns. They were the forge in which the early Islamic State learned it could survive without its founder. Abu Bakr sent a new set of orders: invade Persia. No Arab force had ever broken a superpower in open battle. Stick around until the end, and subscribe if this is your kind of history. The Sassanid Persian Empire controlled everything from the Zagros Mountains to the borders of India. It had existed for 4 centuries. Its capital, Ctesiphon, was one of the wealthiest cities on earth. Its military was built around the cataphract, the heavily armored cavalry that had terrorized Rome's eastern legions for generations. Its administration was sophisticated, multilingual, and ruthlessly efficient. It had recently concluded a devastating 30-year war with Byzantium that had exhausted both empires but left Persia in control of Egypt, Syria, and Anatolia before the Byzantines pushed them back. Khalid crossed into Persian Mesopotamia in the spring of 633 with approximately 18,000 men. The first major engagement was the Battle of Chains, named for the Persian tactic of chaining their infantry together to prevent retreat. He faced a combined Persian-Arab-Christian force under a Persian general named Hormuz. The Persians assumed the Arabs would scatter when faced with disciplined heavy infantry. He feigned retreat, drew the Persian center forward, then hit both flanks, simultaneously with his cavalry. The chained infantry could not maneuver. They were slaughtered where they stood. Hormuz was killed in single combat. Sources differ on whether he killed Hormuz personally or whether it was one of his commanders, but the result was the same. The Persian force ceased to exist. He moved deeper into Mesopotamia. The Battle of Riva came next. A Persian relief force arrived to stop him. The fighting lasted a full day along the banks of a tributary of the Euphrates. The Persians were pushed into the water. Al-Walid records that the river ran red for miles downstream. The phrase appears in multiple sources. It was not poetic exaggeration. Thousands of men died in a space narrow enough that their bodies dammed the flow. Then came Walaja. The Persians sent a force commanded by Andarzaga, an experienced general who understood he was facing something unprecedented. Andarzaga had superior numbers. Estimates range between 20,000 and 30,000 men against his 18,000. He positioned his army in a defensive formation with heavy cavalry on the flanks and infantry in the center, backed by a fortified camp. The answer was double envelopment. He divided his cavalry into 3 groups. The center engaged Andarzaga's infantry directly. The flanks swung wide, circled behind the Persian position, and closed the trap. It was the same trap Hannibal had used at Cannae 800 years earlier. The Persians were surrounded. Their fortified camp became a killing ground. Andarzaga was killed. The survivors fled toward Ctesiphon, with news that an Arab general was loose in Mesopotamia, using tactics that should not have been possible with tribal cavalry. The Battle of Ulis followed within weeks. Al-Waqid's account of Ulis becomes almost surreal. He faced a combined Persian and Christian Arab force that included war elephants, animals the Arab cavalry had never encountered. The horses panicked. He ordered his men to target the elephants directly with massed archery until the animals broke and trampled their own lines. The battle devolved into close combat. His forces held. The Persians broke. The casualties were beyond counting. Sources claim the blood of the slain filled the irrigation channels around the battlefield for days. Al-Hira fell in April 633. Al-Hira was the administrative center of Persian Mesopotamia. It was also a Christian Arab city, proof that the conflict was not simply Arab versus Persian, but a more complex realignment of tribal and religious loyalties across the region. He negotiated a surrender. The city paid tribute. A garrison went in and he moved north. In less than a year, he had destroyed Persia's military capacity in the west. He had done it with a force that should not have been able to challenge a regional garrison, let alone the full weight of an empire. The Sassanids pulled their remaining forces east to defend Ctesiphon and the heartland. They abandoned their western provinces. While he was dismantling Persia's western armies, another Muslim army was fighting in Syria. The campaign there was going badly. The Byzantines had sent a massive relief force south from Anatolia. The Muslim commanders were divided. They were losing ground. Abu Bakr sent urgent orders: march to Syria immediately and take overall command. The order was impossible. He was in southern Iraq. The Muslim forces in Syria were hundreds of miles west, across a waterless desert the Byzantines considered impassable. What he decided next, Al-Waqidi would later describe as a feat with no parallel in military history. He marched across the Syrian desert in 9 days. He took his most experienced cavalry. Estimates range from 500 to 800 men. He hired Bedouin guides who knew where the seasonal wells were buried under sand. He brought camels loaded with water in sewn leather bags. He had the camels force-fed water until their stomachs were distended. Then he slaughtered a few each day and distributed the water from their stomachs when the wells ran dry. The distance was approximately 250 miles of terrain with no roads, no landmarks, and no margin for navigation error. They arrived in April 634 before the Byzantine commanders knew he had left Iraq. The psychological impact was immediate. The Muslims in Syria, who had been fighting a slow retreat, suddenly had the general who had taken Mesopotamia from Persia in a single campaign. The Byzantines, who thought they were mopping up a regional rebellion, realized they were facing a coordinated invasion led by a man with a reputation for winning battles that should have been impossible. He laid siege to Damascus. The city was one of the wealthiest in the Eastern Roman Empire. It had walls that had stood since before Christ. Its garrison was well supplied and professional. The Byzantine field army was marching south to relieve it. The city had to fall before that army arrived, or fight a two-front battle he could not win. The siege lasted through the summer of 634. Every gate was blockaded. He cut the aqueducts. He sent raiding parties to intercept supply convoys. Inside the city, the Christian population was divided. Some wanted to negotiate. Others wanted to hold out for the Byzantine relief force. Damascus surrendered on September 4th, 635. The terms were generous. The city paid a tribute. The Christian population kept their churches. He left soldiers to hold the city and moved north to intercept the Byzantine army before it could regroup. What followed was the largest battle of his career. The Battle of Yarmouk took place in August 636 in a valley south of the Golan Heights. The Byzantine Emperor Heraclius sent a force of approximately 40,000 men, infantry, heavy cavalry, Armenian auxiliaries, Christian Arab allies. It was the largest army Byzantium had fielded in a generation, and its objective was simple: retake Syria and destroy the Muslim invasion before it spread. His force numbered roughly 25,000, though estimates vary. He was outnumbered. He was fighting on terrain the Byzantines knew better. His supply lines stretched back hundreds of miles across desert. The battle lasted 6 days. Day 1 was skirmishing. Both sides probed for weaknesses. He positioned the army with a ravine at its back, the Yarmouk River Gorge, steep enough that retreat would mean death. It was a calculated risk. His men could not run. They would fight with the certainty that losing meant the gorge behind them. Day 2, the Byzantines attacked the Muslim center. The line held, barely. Men in the front ranks were dying faster than they could be replaced. The fighters behind them could hear the Byzantine drums through the dust. Fresh troops rotated into the line, and the exhausted ones came back bleeding. He was fighting a battle of endurance, not breakthrough. Day 3, a portion of the Muslim army wavered. The sources describe women, the wives and mothers who had followed the army from Medina, entering the battlefield to shame the men into holding their positions. The line stabilized. Day 4, he began pushing his cavalry against the Byzantine flanks. He could not break them yet, but he was forcing the Byzantines to extend their line to avoid encirclement. Day 5, a sandstorm struck. Visibility collapsed. Fighting paused. Day 6, he committed everything. Every reserve, every cavalry unit that had been held back through 5 days of bleeding. The charge hit the Byzantine left flank before they finished repositioning from the previous day's probing. The line bent, then it broke. He drove his cavalry through the gap and began rolling up the Byzantine formation from the side, not pushing them back but turning them, folding the line on itself, cutting off retreat before the soldiers at the far end understood what was happening to the soldiers beside them. The Byzantines tried to reposition. Their line fragmented. His cavalry pushed them toward the ravine. The Byzantine army collapsed. Men were pushed over the edge of the gorge. Thousands died in the crush. The survivors fled north. The numbers were staggering. Estimates range from 40,000 to 70,000 dead, though the higher numbers are almost certainly inflated. What is not in dispute is that Byzantium lost Syria permanently in 6 days of fighting in a valley most of the empire had never heard of. Heraclius fled to Antioch, then to Constantinople. He reportedly said farewell to Syria forever as he crossed into Anatolia. He had done it again. Another battlefield littered with the armies that were supposed to stop him. Abu Bakr had died during the siege of Damascus. The new caliph was Umar ibn al-Khattab. Umar's first major decision was to demote him mid-campaign and give overall command to Abu Ubaidah, one of Muhammad's earliest companions. He accepted it without a word and kept winning. Winning was the problem. It came in stages, each one more public than the last, until Khalid ibn al-Walid, the man who had unified Arabia, broken Persia, and taken Syria from the Byzantine Empire, was questioned about his finances in front of his own soldiers in the city he had conquered. Umar ibn al-Khattab became caliph in August 634, while the siege of Damascus was still running. Umar had been one of Muhammad's closest companions. He was famously austere, personally incorruptible, and rigorous in ways that Abu Bakr had not been. Where Abu Bakr had governed through consultation and persuasion, Umar governed through principle. He believed the caliphate was a trust from God, and any deviation from absolute justice was a betrayal of that trust. He also believed that individuals, no matter how talented, no matter how loyal, could become dangerous to the institution if they were allowed to become irreplaceable. Khalid had become irreplaceable. The first demotion happened quietly. Umar sent a letter during the Damascus campaign informing him that Abu Ubaidah would now hold overall command in Syria. He was to serve under him. No explanation was given. The letter was framed as a routine administrative decision. Khalid obeyed. He continued fighting at Yarmouk under Abu Ubaidah's nominal command, though every source makes clear that the tactical decisions were still his. The soldiers knew who their real commander was. The Byzantines knew. Umar knew. That was the problem. After Yarmouk, he was appointed governor of Chinasrin and Chalcis, administrative positions that kept him in Syria, but removed him from field command. He governed competently. There were no reports of corruption or mismanagement. He distributed war spoils according to established practice. He kept the garrison supplied. He maintained order in a newly conquered province where the population was majority Christian, and the Arab presence was a thin layer of military occupation over a civilization that had been Roman for 7 centuries. Umar sent investigators. In 638, he was summoned to Homs and questioned publicly about his distribution of war spoils. The specific accusation was that he had given excessively large rewards to poets and tribal leaders, a common practice in pre-Islamic Arabia, where generosity to allies was a political necessity. Umar considered it wasteful and potentially idolatrous. If people were rewarded for praising Khalid rather than God, the doctrinal implications were unacceptable. The investigation was conducted in front of his troops, the men who had followed him across the desert from Iraq, the men who had held the line at Yarmouk when the Byzantines were pushing them toward the ravine. They watched their commander, the Sword of God, the man who had never lost a battle, stand in a public square and answer questions about whether he had spent too much money rewarding loyalty. The men who had held the Yarmouk line on day 2, bleeding into their armor while the Byzantine drums got louder, watched the same. Commander answered bureaucratic questions about accounting. Nobody recorded what those soldiers said to each other afterward. The sources don't give us that, but al-Walid notes that the garrison remained loyal to him personally until the day he died, which tells you something about what that public square looked like from the outside. No charges were filed. The investigators found no evidence of theft or dishonesty. Umar stripped him of all command anyway. He was removed as governor. He was removed from military command. He was removed from the lists of commanders eligible for future campaigns. Al-Walid records the dismissal with a single line. Umar feared that men would rely on Khalid rather than God. That was the reason. Not corruption, not disloyalty, not incompetence. The caliphate was built on the premise that God granted victory to the faithful. Every battle won was proof of divine favor. Every conquest was evidence that the Muslims were on the correct path. But if victory came to depend on a single man, if soldiers believed they won because he commanded them rather than because God supported them, then the entire foundation of the state was at risk. Umar understood this. He understood that a general who never lost was a contradiction the system could not sustain. If Khalid won because he was Khalid, then God was unnecessary. If Khalid won because God willed it, then any competent commander could replace him. He accepted the dismissal without protest. He did not march on Medina. He did not rally his troops. He did not demand an explanation or a trial or a public defense. He simply stepped down. The sources record no bitterness, no anger, no resentment. He returned to private life in Homs. He kept his property. He lived quietly in the city he had taken from Byzantium 4 years earlier. For 4 years, Khalid ibn al-Walid, the most decorated general in the early Islamic world, had no command, no governorship, no formal role in the state. He had fought to create. He could have seized power. Every soldier in Syria would have followed him. The garrison in Homs was loyal to him personally. The Byzantines were reorganizing in Anatolia for another attempt to retake Syria. The caliphate needed him. He did nothing. He grew older in a house in Homs. He watched younger commanders lead the armies into Egypt, into North Africa, deeper into Persia. He saw men who had served under him take credit for victories won using tactics he had taught them. He listened to reports from the frontiers and knew exactly which mistakes were being made and exactly how he would have avoided them. The campaigns into Egypt went well enough. The push deeper into Persia was slower than it needed to be. He would have known this sitting in a house in Homs the same way a surgeon knows a patient is being mishandled. Not from arrogance, but from the specific fluency that comes from having done the work correctly for 20 years. The knowledge was still there. The capacity was still there. The permission was gone. There is a specific kind of suffering in that. Not the suffering of failure, but the suffering of forced irrelevance, of watching something you built being used by hands that don't fully understand what they're holding. The illness came in 642, not a wound, not an honorable injury from a battlefield. Disease, the body failing from the inside. He had survived 100 battles and been marked by all of them. Every inch of skin bore a scar, but the thing that killed him was invisible, internal, mundane. He was 50 years old. The night before he died, he looked at the weapons hanging on the wall of his room. Sword, shield, lance, the tools that had made him necessary and then dangerous. He dictated his will. He bequeathed his entire estate to Umar ibn al-Khattab and made him executor, the man who had fired him, the man who had humiliated him in front of his troops, the man who had ended his career at its peak and offered no apology. He gave him everything and trusted him to distribute it justly. His last recorded words were a curse on cowards and a lament that he was dying in bed like livestock, instead of on a battlefield where men like him were supposed to die. The sources preserve slight variations, but the core sentiment is consistent. Fury that the sword had been sheathed permanently, that the death he had earned on 100 battlefields had been denied him, that he was ending not in fire, but in a slow mortal fade, in a quiet room in a city that would forget his name. He was buried in Homs. The grave marker listed over 50 battles, 0 defeats. Umar wept when he received the news. Years later, on his own deathbed, Umar was asked who he would have appointed as his successor. He said Khalid's name. Then he paused. Then he said if Khalid had still been alive, he would have appointed him. And if he had already been dead, he would have known God had spared him a terrible choice. Umar also said, near the end, 3 words preserved across multiple sources. I was wrong. Wrong about what exactly is the question the rest of history keeps asking. The armies pushed deeper into Persia. They took Egypt from Byzantium in 642, the same year he was buried. They reached the Atlantic coast of North Africa within a generation. They crossed into Spain in 711. They reached the gates of Constantinople in 717. Within a century of Muhammad's death, the Caliphate controlled territory from the Pyrenees to the Indus River, the largest empire the world had seen since Rome. None of it required him. That was Umar's point. The institution was larger than any individual. God granted victory to the faithful, not to indispensable men. The conquest of the known world proceeded on schedule with him dismissed, retired, and eventually dead. The system worked exactly as Umar believed it should, except the later campaigns were slower, more costly. The Byzantine reconquest attempts came closer to succeeding. The push into Anatolia stalled. The siege of Constantinople failed. Egypt rebelled twice and had to be reconquered. The administration of the new territories was chaotic. Governors were appointed and recalled. Tax systems collapsed and were rebuilt. Entire provinces were lost to local uprisings and retaken at enormous cost. He would not have let any of that happen. The siege of Constantinople in 717 lasted over a year and ended in catastrophic Muslim losses. Disease, starvation, a winter the fleet was not equipped for. The Byzantine fleet used Greek fire against ships whose commanders had never faced it before and had no prepared answer for it. The Muslim force that retreated from Constantinople in 718 had lost tens of thousands of men to cold and hunger, and a weapon nobody had thought to anticipate. He had spent his career anticipating exactly this kind of problem, studying enemies before engaging them, adjusting tactics to terrain and conditions, never walking into a situation he hadn't already mapped in his head. The commanders who led the Constantinople campaign were capable men. They were not him. The difference showed in the casualty counts. He had governed Chinasrin and Chalcis competently. He had kept supply lines functioning across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. He understood that conquest was only half the problem. Holding what you took required different skills. and he had demonstrated those skills in the brief period Umar allowed him to use them. The question is whether Umar was right to be afraid, and the answer is probably yes. In a state built on doctrinal principles, a man who wins every battle becomes a doctrinal problem. If people believe he grants victory, they stop believing God does. And if they stop believing God does, the entire justification for the caliphate collapses. Umar was not governing a secular empire. He was managing a religious movement that had transformed into a state without losing its claim to divine mandate. Allowing him to continue would have required accepting that the state's survival depended on a single mortal man. That was unacceptable. But dismissing him meant sacrificing the most effective instrument the early caliphate ever produced. It meant accepting slower victories, higher casualties, and the loss of institutional knowledge that could not be replaced. It meant choosing principle over pragmatism at enormous cost. Umar made that choice. He accepted it. And the fact that both men understood the necessity of the decision does not make it less tragic. The tragedy is not that Umar was wrong to be afraid. The tragedy is that he was probably right, and the cost of being right was dismissing the most effective commander in Islamic history at the peak of his capability. Both of those things were true simultaneously. Both men paid for that decision. Umar paid with the slower, bloodier conquests that followed. He paid with 4 years of obsolescence and a death that felt like theft. And when Umar wept at the news of his death, and when he said years later that he had been wrong, he was not saying he should have kept him in command. He was saying that there were problems for which no right answer existed. Some contradictions cannot be resolved. Some choices destroy something essential, no matter which option you take. What he became in those final 4 years is the part of the story the sources cannot fully answer. He lived quietly. He caused no trouble. He made Umar his executor. He obeyed every order. He accepted humiliation without protest. He demonstrated the same discipline in retirement that he had demonstrated on the battlefield. Was that virtue? Or was it the behavior of a man who had spent so long being a weapon that he no longer knew how to be anything else? Muhammad had called him the sword of God. Swords do not choose when they are drawn or sheathed. They do not question the hand that wields them. They do not have desires or ambitions, independent of their function. He lived up to that title so completely that when Umar decided the sword needed to be put away, he agreed. He agreed because that was what the sword was supposed to do. But swords do not die furious in their beds, cursing cowards and lamenting the death they were denied. Swords do not feel rage that they are gathering dust on a wall. He did. In his final words, he was not a weapon. He was a man who had wanted something, recognition, vindication, the death that matched the life, and had been denied it by the same institution he had served without question. The institution that produced him could not contain what it produced. A sword sharp enough to take 2 empires is also sharp enough to cut the hand that holds it. Umar understood this. So did the man on the wall. The later chroniclers remembered him as a hero. His tomb in Homs became a site of pilgrimage. His tactics were studied and imitated. His name appeared in the histories alongside the Rashidun caliphs as one of the architects of the early conquests. But the state did not need him. That was the point. The conquests continued without him. The empire expanded without him. The institution he had fought to create survived his dismissal and his death and his 4 years of forced irrelevance. He had done his job too well. He had proven that an individual could be indispensable, and in proving it, he had made himself intolerable. Umar had been right to fear that, whether he believed that. Whether any part of him, in that room in Homs with the reports from the frontier arriving and the armies moving without him, had stopped believing it. That is the question the sources cannot answer, and the one that matters most. The weapons hung on the wall in Homs, the sword that had taken Persia and Rome, gathering dust in a room. He had defeated every enemy they sent. He had lost to the one thing no enemy could deliver, the judgment of the man who trusted him most. The sword of God was sheathed. It never came out again. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below. Umar said 3 words near the end of his life that have never been fully explained. I was wrong. Wrong about the dismissal. Wrong about the fear. Wrong about what it cost. The sources record the words and leave the answer open. History has been sitting with that question for 14 centuries. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories like this one.